All right, we're live. Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews, the podcast where we talk about a variety of books from a Marxist and anarchist perspective. And as usual, I'm joined by my co host, Justin Clark. Thanks for joining me, Justin.
Thanks for having me, Corey. I'm wearing white today, and it's my new Smashing Pumpkins t-shirt. Hopefully it comes up in some ways, but in other ways it doesn't. But I don't usually wear white because I'm so afraid of getting something on it during the day.
Right.
You try new things. You try to branch out of your usual wearing dark
Yeah.
stuff all the time.
Break out of the comfort zone.
Break out of the comfort zone. You wear something a little different. So we're a week in to as of recording. We are a week into the Trump administration. Volume 2. Guarantee you, second season will not be as good as the first, if the first was even good at all.
Right.
So it can only be worse. And one thing that is very interesting that has been really coming out is that if you look at a lot of the people within Donald Trump's orbit, whether it's newly confirmed Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, whether it's his prospective OMB director Russ Vought, and others, that there's kind of a through line that connects them, and it's Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And I've said this before, we were talking about this in the pregame, but I don't think Trump is successful without the Christian nationalist right. He was elected with them and has governed for them, and that the ramifications of Christian nationalism have been playing out a lot over the last 20 years, especially over the last 10. Whether it's the continuing growth of the voucher programs for private schools and using public money towards private schools, often private religious schools, whether it's the direct public subsidy of churches or other organizations, and of course the 2022 Supreme Court decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, which pushed the abortion rights movement 50 years back, and it pushed it towards moving it back to the states and back to the system that was in place pre-Roe, which has been disastrous, not just for women, but for children and for anyone who can have a child.
Yeah.
And all of these are connected. And the book we're going to talk about tonight was a book that, had Kamala Harris won, I don't know if we do this book. But I think that because Trump won and because of the obstacles I think we face now, I think that we have to understand Christian nationalism to understand where we are.
For sure.
So tonight's book is The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism by Katherine Stewart.
Okay.
Katherine Stewart is an investigative journalist. She has written for a variety of outlets, including the New York Times, the New Republic, the New York Review of Books, and a bunch of other publications. And she has, for the last 20 years or so, has really focused in and on a laser focus in on the rise of the radical Christian right in America. Her first book was called The Good News Club, which was about something called the Good News Clubs, which were set up in elementary schools and in other public schools across the country that were blurring the line between what was traditional public education, secular public education, and what was religious education. And of course, because Christian nationalists, right-wing Christian nationalists, are weasels, they weasel their way into places. They don't tend to, they're not as bold as you would expect them to be in some circumstances. Although that's starting to change now that they have a lot more power.
Yep.
But 20 years ago, they would. So if you were to have these like good news clubs that were set up by, I think it's called like the Christian Fellowship of America or something like that, CFA or something like that, which is the parent organization for these good news clubs, is that it's this increasing blurring of the line between the separation of the church of state. That wall of separation, as Jefferson called it, gets continually sort of chipped at bit by bit by bit, because it's death by 1,000 cuts. And So that was her first book, and this is her second book. And I've not read The Good News Clubs. I will probably go back and read it now, having read this book. I think this book is great. I think it's a really thorough, interesting, and harrowing account of how Christian nationalism rose in America, and how it developed, how it grew out of really pernicious aspects of American history, particularly slavery, and segregation and discrimination, and how it uses modern tools of politics to achieve very non-modern, very antiquated, very archaic forms of belief. And so, so I think it's really important to know that the big reason why we're in the boat that we're in is that all these religious nationalist groups, whether it's Focus on the Family or the Family Research Council, or whether it's these other different groups, they are all paid for by very deep pockets. And part of that is the consequence of a variety of different Supreme Court decisions and laws that have happened over the last 50 plus years.
Right.
Two of them are super important. One of them is Buckley v. Valeo, which is in the 1970s. And Buckley v. Valeo is one of the core Supreme Court arguments that essentially means that money equals speech. That and then 15 years ago in 2010 was the Citizens United decision.
Right.
And the Citizens United decision, again, probably one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions in my lifetime, in our lifetimes, because I don't think you get to Donald Trump, you don't get to the billionaire oligarch hellscape that we're in now without Citizens United, where Elon Musk could put $250 million into Trump's campaign.
Yeah.
Because essentially that money is speech.
Yeah. And
so
corporations are people. So yeah.
Corporations are people, right? And that's really the argument, right? That corporations are people. People have speech rights, free speech rights. Therefore, corporations should have speech rights.
Yeah. And money counts as speech.
Money counts as speech. Therefore, money is speech. Like it's and that's really the trouble. So one of the things you notice right away in her book is that there's all of these like different organizations and groups that are funding all of this.
Yeah.
And so it's not like, so there's all these different organizations. So she names a few of them in the introduction. So it's like without the DeVos family. So Betsy DeVos, who was the first Trump Secretary of Education.
Right.
And the Prince family, who are involved in Blackwater, the private military contract.
Yeah, they're the mercenaries.
The mercenaries, right? You have the Bradley Foundation, the Howard Amundsen Jr., the foundations of Richard Mellon Scaife, the James M. Olin Foundation, the Lyman Foster Friess Family Foundation, the McClellan Foundation. All of these monies, the Green family that own Hobby Lobby, right?
Right.
Not to mention the fact that you have all of these other dark money groups, whether it's as I mentioned earlier, specifically, if you think of like the Family Research Council or Focus on the Family, or what's called the Family, which is like the Council of National, the Council for National Policy, which is sort of a generic name, but it is also funded by these very extreme right, very well-funded groups that then use their money and networking to build systems of alternative power. Right. In terms of the left, where I think it's fair to say that in a lot of ways these people are right Leninists, in the sense that they genuinely believe that there's an ideological vanguard that exists to sort of nudge the public into a position of revolutionary importance, right? And I think that's true. And I think that that's been one of the challenges of watching the sort of liberal left be unable to challenge it, because in some ways they're bringing a knife to a gunfight. They're playing checkers when these guys are playing chess, and part of that's money, but that's not enough of an excuse, because there's a lot of money on the sort of left liberal nonprofit sphere, right? Whether it's whether it's historically a lot of Silicon Valley, not so much anymore. Silicon Valley sort of pivoted very hard to the right in the last 5 years. But historically, whether it's Bill Gates or George Soros or these other like left liberal, philanthropic foundations, they exist.
Yeah.
But one, they don't have as much money. Like the ACLU is not as well funded as the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is sort of the right-wing version of the ACLU. And part of that's just a consequence of inequality, right? Like one of the ways that you could stop Christian nationalism in its tracks is by taxing the rich. I mean, it really comes down to having a economic policy where you don't have such rampant inequality.
Right.
I don't think religious nationalism gains the kind of cachet that it has in America without it, and so they would be far more marginal than otherwise. But it's the money, because they have so much money at disposal, most of which is either a tax deductible gift or it's just tax free in general. It allows for that gravy train to flow so hard that they are able to build the sort of infrastructure and campaigns to change the country in the direction they want, regardless of what the broader public actually wants, because the broader public doesn't want any of this. I mean, even the majority of Christians in America don't even really want any of this.
Yeah.
Most Christians in America aren't hard right Christian nationalists. So we'll get into some of the details tonight about where this comes from, the origins of a lot of it, which Stuart does a really good job of outlining a lot of the history of this and how we got there. But before we get to that, do we have anybody joining us tonight? Do we have any comments so far?
We have no comments as of this moment.
Okay.
We've had the viewer numbers have been going up and then down and then up and then down.
Up and down.
Yeah. So.
Well, okay. So let's sort of talk about how this kind of works in practice. So she opens the book talking about going, because she went to one of these, she went to a lot of like right-wing events where she would take the temperature of where people were. And one of the things you get right, once you figure out right away, is that these really well-funded Christian nationalist organizations are really good at developing propaganda and literature to provide to pastors. Because their whole attitude is, well, if we can get the pastors, we can get the public. We can get their parishioners. We don't necessarily have to we don't necessarily have to propagandize to every single parishioner on our own. We can just give it to the pastors. So you'll often see how in violation of existing law, right? Which the federal government doesn't do a very good job of enforcing, even under Democrats. And specifically the Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment was an amendment added to an appropriations bill in the 1950s by then Senator Lyndon Johnson, before he became president, that basically said that public monies cannot go to religious organizations for the explicit purpose of endorsing individual candidates.
Yeah.
So what Christian nationalist organizations will often do is they'll sort of develop literature where they're not explicitly endorsing a specific candidate per se, but they're sort of nudging you to the way that you should vote. So, and the way that they do that is with the issue of abortion. Abortion is really the linchpin that holds the religious nationalist right together. But it wasn't always that. Mm-hmm. And she talks in the book about how that changed and why that changed, and we'll get to that in a bit. Okay. But abortion is often the issue that will unite people in that space. And so, she writes about how they will provide this literature to people where it's like, here are the two candidates, or here are the two or three major candidates, and here are their stances on specific positions. So if it's a Democrat, generally they're going to be pro-choice, although there are pro-life Democrats. My former U.S. Senator Joe Donnelly, who was a Democrat, was pro-life. And part of that was because he was a Catholic. But even most American Catholics are pro-choice. I mean, there's a huge gulf. That's the thing that's very interesting about religious nationalism, is that it's such a small sector of the country, and yet it has such an outsized influence. Yeah. And part of that is money, but part of that is that they really know we talk about this all the time about how conservatives in America are just better at politics than liberals
Yeah.
are. They're just fundamentally good at it, better at it, because they understand that politics is about power, how you acquire power and what you do with it. It's not just this sort of moral game where if we say all the right things the right ways that everybody will sort of agree with us. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But anyway, so they'll give these voter guides out to people, and they pretty much come up to pretty much saying how you should vote. And of course, these people are super pro-Trump, and we're thrilled that Trump won, because this book was published in 2020. And obviously, the hope was that you publish the book and then, oh, well, that's behind us. No, it's not. Right. So that's why we're talking about it, because a lot of what's going on in the book is stuff that continued on, obviously, until today. So, you couldn't. So the Johnson Amendment was explicitly about making sure that money, tax-free deductions that were supposed to go for the purposes of churches go into the hands of politicians. That's generally what it's trying to avoid.
Right.
And the religious right in America have been very clear about them wanting to do away with the Johnson Amendment. I mean, when Mike Pence was vice president, he explicitly said that.
Yeah.
At other events.
Don't they have, like, a lot of churches, they have like a specific day where they're like, we're breaking the rule today?
Yes, they do. She doesn't mention, I don't remember if she mentions that in the book, but yes, they do. They have a very specific day where they break the rule. And so that's why I tell people, I heard this from someone, and I agree. I can't remember where I heard this, but it's like, these people meet on Sunday every day and they're planning what to do. What are you doing?
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that's been one of the reasons why I think religious nationalism, Christian nationalism, has been so successful in America too, is because in America, because of decades and decades of hollowing out of the social fabric of America through neoliberalism and globalization and the hollowing out of the government, and especially social democracy or the welfare state, there aren't very many avenues left for can have some form of social solidarity, right? And so there's really only two left in America that have a huge sway on anything. One is sports, and the other one is religion. And so even though they might be a minority, but they're meeting every Sunday, they're planning every Sunday, they're working, they're learning, right? So it's that's what makes it so difficult to fight back against them, because the left doesn't, in America at least, does not really have that network yet.
Right.
The most logical way we would do that would be through unions, which is what it's been historically, right?
Right.
And so the growth of unions, which is why they want to try to stop the growth of unions. It's why Trump just fired one of the Biden appointees to the NLRB, the lead counsel of the National Labor Relations Board, is because which is funny, because then they talk about how much they're pro-worker and we care about the working class, and yet they do this kind of shit. It's all a smoke and mirrors game, as you figure out. And so what you realize is that these people are super, super conservative. Of course, they're anti-abortion. They are, of course, anti-LGBTQ rights. They are extremely militaristic. A lot of times, people who are in this space are like former generals or they're former high-level officials in the U.S. military. And it's no surprise that I think that that's the way that kind of is. Right. And so what you recognize is that that they have sort of infiltrated all aspects of American life in ways that people don't realize. So, for example, she talks about a guy named Ralph Drollinger who founded something called Capital Ministries, which is about providing Bible studies in the U.S. Congress. Now, I don't have a problem with like Congress people meeting together by sharing their faith or philosophical point of view. I don't have a problem with that. The bigger issue is that they're doing it often on public grounds during publicly administered meetings and things like that. That's kind of the bigger issue. And so when you recognize that, it's really pernicious. And again, they're very well funded. I mean, this is the other thing too. I mean, that's and they have extremely socially backward views.
Yeah.
A lot of times they are, of course, that wives should submit to their husbands. That corporal punishment against children is okay.
Yep.
That men need to suck it up and not think about don't get emotional, don't feel like you have to work through things or think about your feelings or anything like that. Just suck it up. There's a lot of that sort of really pernicious, whether it's like toxic masculinity, notions of patriarchy, violence. And I feel like what's interesting is that we live in a space now where Americans are becoming more and more non-religious, and yet the religious right has more power.
Yeah.
And part of that is because they vote. So, Stuart talks about Ralph Reed, who's one of the old school people who has been involved in the hardcore religious right for decades.
Okay.
And I think he's part of like the Faith and Freedom Coalition, and which is his organization. But he's basically explicit. He said, look, I know that hard right evangelicals in America, or hard right Christian nationalists in America, are the minority, and they're growing smaller.
Yeah.
But we can mobilize them, because all that ever matters at the end of the day is who shows up on voting day, who's at the polls. And I think this is especially evident in both of Trump's elections. When the Democratic Party ran pretty uninspiring candidates, whether it was Hillary Clinton or Kamala Harris, where when you run them, and Harris was more, I guess, to a certain extent, more inspiring than Hillary, although that sort of the enthusiasm certainly waned as that campaign went on. But because the traditional Democratic electorate was so unenthusiastic about 2016 or 2024, that millions just stayed home. Obviously, a lot of it was also opposition to the ongoing genocide in Palestine and in Gaza, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the Biden administration's complete and total complicity in that.
Yeah.
And there's been some interesting polling coming out from YouGov that is pretty much dedicated that a good chunk of the reason why Kamala Harris won was because of that. That is actually a much more important issue than even I considered at the time.
Right.
And so when you depress your voting base, it makes the minority voting base, and when I'm using the word minority, I mean like the Christian nationalists.
Yeah.
It makes their votes count more because there are fewer votes on the Democratic or liberal side. And Ralph Reed's very clear about that. He's like, but we get our people out. We mobilize them because we can. And I think that's really one of the things that is super frustrating. I mean, so Ralph Drollinger, who was the head of the Capitol Ministries, I mean, he was doing weekly Bible studies with White House officials, whether it was the head of HHS, the administrator of NASA, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, like all of these people who are really high up in the Trump administration. And so this is the first term, and it's no surprise that there's this weird melding of the church, specifically Christian nationalism in the state, and in a way that is, I think, particularly pernicious in the sense that it's a way of being able to hold back forms of social and economic progress. Because, and Stuart mentioned this too, like if you have like a faith community and you're trying to get them to vote, and they ask a question about the minimum wage, or they mention what really matters more, someone gets paid a little bit more or life, right? This is where you get the sort of anti-abortion,
right?
And I think that component is super important to understanding the religious rights and continuing assault on democratic norms and civil rights in America. And we'll pivot into talking about abortion here in a sec. But before we do that, do we have any comments?
Yeah, we got a couple. Velkin999 is here.
Hi, thanks for being here.
And said, that's this one over here. The melding of religion and country is genius and scary. It makes being devoted to country the same as being devoted to God. It's mixing what's real and what isn't, in my eyes.
Right. That's exactly right. So, and if we talk about histories of nationalism, I think of whether it's Benedict Anderson's book Imagine Communities or Eric Hobsbawm's book Invention of a Tradition, where nationalism is also kind of a fiction, where the nation state itself is not a fiction; it exists, right? But national, like a national conception, is also a sort of a figment of an imagination of a culture of a people. And so when you can sort of blend this very specific, very conservative form of Christianity to a nationalist project that is, in some respects, probably ethno-nationalist in the sense that they're not particularly fond of racial minorities, although that creates tension within the Christian nationalist movement, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But because you have that sort of mix, it becomes super, super toxic. Because at the end of the day, then you have a huge chunk of the electorate, or just a huge chunk of the populace, that are completely motivated by bullshit.
Yeah,
I mean, they're just completely motivated by nonsense, and it sort of destroys their capacity for rational thought. It destroys their capacity to have empathy for others, because it's a very in-group, out-group kind of thing, and that's a big component of Christian nationalism. And so I think you're right. It is very dangerous, and it is very scary. Thanks for your comment.
Zach, or Peter Pizza, said not to carry water for the founding fathers, but from my understanding, they even understood mixing religion and the state was a bad idea.
Oh my God, of course. Absolutely. I'm, as somebody who has studied a lot about the Revolutionary period and has studied the founding fathers and have written about them, one thing I can tell you is that's absolutely the case. I mean, the founding fathers are very explicit. Whether it's Thomas Jefferson writing in his letter to the Danbury Baptists, explicitly saying that we need to build a wall of separation between church and state.
Right.
Jefferson, of course, writing the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which in my estimation is still one of the most radical documents ever written, because the idea of creating a secular society where people are free to exercise their religion, and they can, and in a pluralistic system where people are free to pursue their religious beliefs, but then they are also free to participate in society, and then we have those balances between the two. That's still a very radical notion. You can say a lot about the United States; it's not great. Trust me, I can sit here all night with that. But the one thing that the founders did really right, and I think that we can, which is a heritage that we should continue, is this idea of freedom of conscience, which is a classic Enlightenment ideal. To be free to exercise the contents of one's mind. I mean, that's a foundational freedom. You take that away, you've given the game away. And so the founders really understood that. They were also students of history. The founders clearly understood. Having been, again, think of them. They're writing in the late 18th, early 19th century, so they're not that far removed from the religious wars in Europe of the 16th, 17th centuries. So it's whether it's the 30 Years' War or the continued clashes between Protestants and Catholics, obviously going all the way back to the Crusades in the Middle Ages. They recognized that by melding the state and the church, it opened up avenues for untold violence. Because at the end of the day, when you have that melding of the state and the church, it does create that in-group, out-group mentality. Because the whole point of building the free, secular, democratic republic, which is what the founders built, was to protect not just the rights of the majority, but the rights of the minority. That minority rights are important. Now that can have its own problems, right? Like Chomsky's written about this, where he talks about James Madison talking about protecting the opulent minority, or we're protecting the rich, right? Like that has its own problems, right? And I agree with him on that. Having said that, though, you never want a society that is being either that is either a tyranny of the majority or a tyranny of the minority. You want
Right.
neither one. And the founders, I think, explicitly tried to set up the American government to be neither. And so I think you're absolutely right. The other thing that's really important is James Madison. So James Madison wrote something called a Memorial and Remonstrance, where he explicitly said that public money should not go to religious institutions, period. So you're absolutely right. There's also the Treaty of Tripoli, where they said
Right.
that, the United States is founded in no part or in no way upon the Christian religion. It's very clear, like the founders were extremely clear. And for most of American history, that notion of building a secular society was the norm. And that essentially it came to its apex within the 1950s and the 1960s, where you see a wave of Supreme Court decisions under the Warren Court that liberalize religious rights and personal rights in America, culminating in Roe v. Wade. But before Roe v. Wade, you have the other previous Supreme Court decisions that banned involuntary prayer in schools, that banned religious displays in public schools, that made very clear, and those go hand in hand with desegregation, right? So you can imagine white Christian nationalists are pissed because it's like, oh, I have to take the Bible out of schools and we have to put the blacks in. Like, that's like a nightmare scenario for these bigots, right? And that's going to be something we talk about here in a minute. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the founders were very clear on this, unambiguously clear, I think, on this, where they were ambiguous on many other things, but on this they were not, because they understood explicitly. The U.S. Constitution never, ever mentions the word God.
Right.
The word God does not appear in the U.S. Constitution at all. And it only really appears in the Declaration of Independence, of talking about in nature and nature's God, which is sort of an Enlightenment deist notion of God. It's not, the sort of the God of the old time religion. And so the U.S. Constitution mentions religion exactly twice, and both of them are proscriptions against what religion can't do, what religion can and can't do. One of them is the First Amendment, which explicitly says that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof, and that goes in with free speech. So you have the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause.
Yeah.
And then you have the other one, which is that there should be no religious litmus test for public office.
Right.
So, and so it's very clear. The Constitution is extremely clear that the United States of America is a secular government founded upon secular institutions for secular goals.
Right.
That's the point. And so Christian nationalists will often try to undermine this history. And that gets us into talking a little bit of a section about this guy named David Barton, who is this like hard right historian. I'm putting that in scare quotes because he's not very good at it. And he says these kinds of things where the United States was founded as a Christian nation, because that's what Christian nationalists believe. What do they believe? They believe the United States was founded by God to be a Christian nation, for a Christian nation for Christians.
Right.
And nobody else matters in the framework of Christian nationalism. So if you're an atheist, or you're a Muslim, or you're Jewish, or you're Hindu, or you're just Christian, but you're not like them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And they're explicitly against all that. And Barton has written series and series of pseudo-histories that outline, the America as a Christian nation, that the founding fathers were all devout evangelical Christians, which is not true. Jefferson was not a Christian. Ben Franklin was not a Christian. And those that were Christians, they were far more liberal in their theology than these people would have you believe, whether it's George Washington or others. That's not to say that there weren't hard right religious founding fathers. There were.
Sure.
There were very religious founding fathers, like Patrick Henry, but and others. But many of them were men of the Enlightenment. They were highly educated, and so. Being highly educated lends oneself to not being a complete and total ideologue, religious or otherwise.
Yeah.
And so But Barton, back to Barton, he wrote a book years ago called The Jefferson Lies, which is all about like sort of trying to expose the lies that people have told about Thomas Jefferson, whether it's his belief in the separation of church and state, or that his relationship with Sally Hemings, his slave, was not true. And the book was so bad. The book was so bad that the publisher pulled it from circulation.
For sure. Yeah, like that's just none of that is true. So
no, the book was so bad that the publisher, which I believe was Thomas Nelson, which is a Christian publisher, the book was so bad, and there were numerous refutations by well acclaimed historians across multiple disciplines and political backgrounds. Even conservatives were like, even some conservative historians were like, this is just not true. This is not true. But Barton has sort of weaseled his way into all of these different hard right Christian nationalist groups in America and sort of helped them on policy. So he helps them write policy about how to infiltrate public schooling or how to develop private schooling and so on. So yeah, so the founders were not, they weren't atheists. I think it's or at least they weren't explicitly atheists. Jefferson's probably the closest, probably the most radical. Him and Thomas Paine. Actually, Thomas Paine's probably the most radical. Because he wrote a whole book called The Age of Reason, where he basically rips Christianity a new asshole. So, but anyway, you're absolutely right. So that was a long answer to your question, but it did cover a lot of what's in the book about they distort history, and this is a tactic of authoritarians where they will use history not as an illuminating enterprise,
right,
but as an enterprise of propaganda.
Yep, for sure. Velkin 999 also said, now when I hear that this country was founded on Christianity, I want to hand anyone saying it texts of the founding fathers' actual thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that they don't realize, and this is the thing about Christian nationalism, is that it's a self-defeating project. Because if, let's say, for example, the United States became a theocracy, right? And it had a very established, very specific form of religion. The problem is what happens when that form of religion falls out of power? Yeah. Because it eventually will, right? Yeah. What happens with that? And the thing is if the Christian nationalists ever really got full power in America, I personally believe, and maybe this is a hopeful take, that they would cannibalize themselves, because eventually these very fragile relationships, these very fragile alliances would start to fray. Yeah. They would start to fall apart, because you have radical Protestants, you have the sort of evangelical Protestants, and then you have conservative Catholics.
Yeah.
And they have both of them have very clear lines of theology that are very, very different.
Yeah.
And well up until mid-20th century America, Protestants and Catholics didn't walk lockstep on things. They just generally didn't.
Yeah.
In America, if someone asked you what's your religion and you said I'm a Christian 100 years ago, that would have sounded weird. Yeah. You would have said something like, well, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Protestant, I'm a Lutheran, I'm an Episcopalian, I'm a Baptist. You would say the denominations. What the Christian right has done very, very effectively is sort of flatten all of that discourse.
Right.
So they'll use things like Judeo-Christian values, and it's Christian values. They throw the Judeo on the front in order to get the sort of that's a way of getting the Zionists in on the project, like the radical conservative Zionists, the conservative Jews, the Norman Podhoretz set, the Mitch Decter sect of the 1970s, and these people whose family were Holocaust survivors, but said that we should pretty much do the same thing to the gays that the Nazis did to the Jews. I mean, they're pretty gross. Gore Vidal wrote a great essay in the 70s called The Pink Triangle and the Yellow Square, that kind of goes, or yellow, pink triangle and yellow star, that kind of goes into all of this and the sort of unholy alliance between conservative Jews and conservative Christians.
Right.
But those tensions exist. And so if one of them got into power, they would war with one another at some point, and one would win over the other one. And then that form of religion would fall out of favor. And then this other form of religion would fall into favor. And the whole point of the American experiment was to say, we're not doing any of that.
Yeah.
That's not the proper role of government. The proper role of government is not to tell people what to believe. The proper role of government is to protect people's rights and to secure social rights, positive and negative liberties, right? That's what governments exist to do. They exist to solve common problems with common solutions that everyone can agree on, or at least the majority will agree on, without the limitation of the liberty of the minority, without a reasonable explanation, right?
Right.
That's the point. And so, because they think it's like they'll be in power forever. No, there would be tensions. And we could just, and the Sounders were very clear, like, let's just avoid all of that, because we saw what it did to Europe. Millions of people died over this shit. Let's stop it. Let's build a government predicated upon rights rather than upon duties to God. Yeah. So it's very clear about that. But Barton is one of those people who is a sort of pseudo historian. There are a lot of these books, right? Like there's one called George Washington's Sacred Fire, which is another one that was very popular about 15 years ago because Glenn Beck talked about it on his show, and it essentially tries to cast George Washington in a completely different light, like where he's like some kind of like Christian nationalist. I mean, that famous image that people think of George Washington, like kneeling to pray, like there's no historical evidence he did any of that. I mean, I'm not saying that George Washington didn't pray. He probably did. Right. But this idea that he prayed the way he did, and it was all very sort of symbolic, and it's all a myth. This is all nationalist myth building. It's not true. He didn't, and so that's really the problem I have with this stuff as a historian, is that it flattens the discourse of nuance and complexity in the service of propaganda.
Yeah. Velkin 999 also said, in reference to the tyranny of the majority.
Yeah.
The only depiction I've seen that struck me was an episode of The Orville. Oddly enough, the episode was called Majority Rule.
Oh, cool. I've never seen that show. I know, if I remember right, I think one of the showrunners of that is Brandon Braga, who worked for many years on Star Trek. I'm just not a huge Seth MacFarlane fan. So it's,
That's fair.
And I do love Star Trek. And I know it's kind of like a spoof of Star Trek, like a la Galaxy Quest. I've just never watched it. But that's the point. A free and democratic society is one where undue burdens are not put upon the majority nor the minority. That there's a society where we live in democracy and pluralism and intolerance. Right? These sort of, I mean, these aren't even socialist values. I mean, these are just broader sort of like Enlightenment, humanist, liberal values, which we'll talk more about when we do about a month from now, when we do the book on liberal socialism, Matt McManus's book.
Cool.
And these are values to hold on to. We shouldn't abandon them, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I think sometimes some on the left tend to overcorrect. And it's like they want to throw out the baby with the bathwater in terms of liberalism. Like, no, there's a lot of good in the liberal project. Yeah. It's only fulfilled through socialism. It's only fulfilled through
that's right. The good stuff comes from the other things that we want.
Yes. But yeah. Do we have any other comments?
Zach also said, do you think the Christian nationalist factions can get along as well as they do because they can each project onto Trump? Those on the outside can clearly tell he isn't a Christian.
Yes. I think that's a really great question. And I think you're absolutely right. So Trump becomes kind of the avatar, right? And part of it is it's because Trump is a very transactional man, right? Like he's like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. He's very much like that. And I think a lot of the political figures, whether it's Reagan, George W. Bush, even Gingrich and the Republican Revolution in the 90s, they could not have been elected without the Christian right, but they often took the Christian right for granted. Yeah. So it was, very much like Democrats often took the working class for granted or minorities for granted, and they realized, oh wait, they may vote for Trump too, and sort of took him for granted. And I felt like the right-wing politicians in America often promised the conservative right a lot of things and didn't deliver. They did deliver a lot, but they didn't always deliver. Yeah. Trump has delivered for them, right? So they see it as being very transactional. They know everything about him. They see him as an imperfect vessel for a perfect cause.
Right.
Right. And if anything sounds like Christianity, it's an imperfect vessel for a perfect cause, right? Like that's
Yeah,
that's
great.
Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And so and so I think you're right. I think they sort of project onto Trump all their hopes and their aspirations and their joys and their fears and their frustrations. That's why it's very cult-like. I think the MAGA stuff is very cult-like.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's because the conservative right have gotten a lot of what they wanted because of him, right? They have a super majority on the court, the Supreme Court, that will be there for a generation, if not two. You have the expansion of the voucher school program. You have obviously the overturning of Roe and all of the religious privileges that people are getting now in a way that they didn't before, right? Because in the framing of Christian nationalism, to them, religious freedom actually means religious privileges.
Yeah.
Traditional form of religious freedom was that the state was not to interfere in your religious activities,
That's
nor
right.
were religious activities were to interfere with the state. That's the point. That's the broader point of the separation of church and state. It protects the church as much as it protects the state. Because that's the other thing too, right? Is imagine that you're a part of a minority faction of a religion and you live in a theocracy.
Mm-hmm.
And the government could then strong arm you to shut down your church, or it could put you in prison, or it could take your money, or ultimately it could kill you.
Well, I look at India, right? Like
exactly.
Narendra Modi and his Hindu nationalists are constantly targeting the Muslim minority that exists there.
Exactly. Right? Or think of Israel, right? I mean, Israel's your example of this.
Yeah.
In modern times. And so it's very disastrous. But Trump gave them what they wanted in a way that conservative leaders of the past did not. And so that's why they're lockstep behind him, because they know how the game is played. I'm sorry, they just do. They know politics is about power.
Yeah.
It's about who gains power and what they do with it. And so, they recognize that on some level. Like I think some of them, if you got them in a room and you were talking to them one-on-one and you would just go, come on, what do you really think about Trump? Some of them, maybe not all of them, but some of them would probably tell you, oh yeah, he's a piece of shit. Like we don't like him at all. He's a terrible human being. But we have the super majority on the court. Roe was overturned.
Yeah.
Like all of this, right? So he's given them a lot of what they want. And I think that's part of the reason they're so behind him.
Yeah, for sure. Velkin 999 also referring to the Orville. I recommend it. It's handled tastefully despite Seth MacFarlane.
That's good. That's good. Let's hope that despite Seth MacFarlane's not doing a lot of heavy lifting. I mean, that's because I really don't like him that much. But he's really good at playing one character, which is the arrogant asshole. He's really good at playing that. The arrogant asshole who's also kind of an idiot. He's very, very good at that. That's his shtick.
That's his role. I enjoyed the show. I don't know how much of a hand he had in the writing of it, but that's his role as the guy.
Yeah.
Arrogant idiot. But
the arrogant idiot. And you can only see that so many times where before you go, I'm good.
Yeah, fair.
Well, and so much of his shit is like mean-spirited too. It's not. I'm just not a fan.
I enjoyed some of the episode, the themes of the episodes, but yeah.
And I imagine a lot of the good stuff is due to Brandon Braga and not him. That would be my hunch. That would be my hunch. Anyway, but yeah. So let's talk about abortion, because abortion is like the key issue that unites the conservative religious right, the nationalists, Christian nationalists, and there's an interesting historical truth that Catherine Stewart lays out in the book that I kind of knew but didn't know all the details about, which is fascinating because it's true, which was that for most of American history, abortion was not an issue.
Right.
It just wasn't.
Yeah.
And well into the 1970s, it wasn't an issue. In fact, the Southern Baptist Convention endorsed the Roe decision in 1973. And many religious organizations actually supported Roe when it first happened. Yeah. Abortion was not this unifying cause. but it became one for a very specific reason. Because the real issue that actually tied the Christian nationalists together the first time was school desegregation.
Right.
So in 1954, with the Brown v. Board decision by the Supreme Court, public schools were desegregated in America. And the religious right collectively lost their minds. And what they did was started setting up what were called segregation academies. And we talked a little bit about this in the Andrew Seidel episode when we talked about his book. And I think it's very apropos to note that their main goal was to try to reinstitute segregation into schools.
Right.
So it was trying to find ways to funnel public money into private religious institutions, particularly these schools. But they knew that if they ran on that at the time, that they knew that was not going to be the unifying thing, because people like public schools.
Yeah, that's
most
right.
Americans like public schools. Most American kids go to public schools. Okay, and so they knew that wasn't going to be the issue that was going to galvanize them and sort of unite them together. And so they it was a very key select number of people. It was people like people like Paul Weyrich, who was this very influential right-wing political operator who was very influential on the rise of the conservative right in America and the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. And so these guys were all cooking up what would be the thing that could tie us all together. What could be the thing? And it was abortion. They realized there was this untapped sort of energy that they could go to, because for a lot of people, that there were people who, abortion is very clear cut for them. They just sort of see it as being, an ending of a life, and for religious reasons. But It wasn't as galvanizing until the religious right started to explicitly organize around it. And because the first president that the Christian evangelicals elected in America was not Ronald Reagan. It was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was the first president elected by the evangelicals. But Jimmy Carter was pro-choice. Jimmy Carter was much more liberal on social issues than the Christian right and the evangelicals were comfortable with. And so Weyrich and others were very adamant to make him a one-term president. And what's interesting is, and this is also in the book, The Invisible Bridge, which is about the downfall of Nixon and the rise of Reagan, Rick Perlstein's third book in his history of the American right, which we're going to do this summer. So we're going to talk about this a little more. But at the 1976 Republican National Convention in Kansas City, there was an anti-abortion plank that was introduced into the party platform very early on. And there was a very, very clear battle between the old guard of the Republican Party, many of whom were feminists who would describe themselves as feminists. They were female Republican operatives, who were sort of Rockefeller Republicans. They were liberal Republicans who were like, this absolutely cannot be in our party platform. And it was a drag-out fight. They won. They won in 1976. That anti-abortion plank was removed from the party platform. But they didn't win in 1980. And so, the religious right used the power of their money and their well-connected groups and their political organizing, especially direct mail, because that was what Weyrich was good at. That was his big thing, was direct mail, which Karl Rove would use a generation later to elect George W. Bush,
right?
Especially in the 2004 reelect, which was very much the big push in the 2004 reelect for George W. Bush was anti-gay marriage, anti-marriage equality. And so you have all of these different people working. You have Paul Weyrich, you have Richard Viguerie, who's another conservative activist, Phyllis Schlafly, who was the lady who led the campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s, who was also extremely pro-life and very anti-abortion. And they're all working together to build a coalition. And this leads to the development of what's called the Moral Majority, which was Jerry Falwell's group, and others. And all of them come together to elect Ronald Reagan in 1980 in the blowout. Their goal was to make Carter a one-term president, and they succeeded.
Yeah.
And so you get a sense that what their real goal was to keep their schools segregated, but they couldn't run on that because the public had changed on that. So they had to run on some other kind of issue. And that other issue was abortion. And they sort of did the other stuff by the back door. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of stuff we've seen today, where we've seen a series of court cases where the power of the government to give public money to private institutions, and particularly churches, has greatly expanded over the last 20 to 30 years.
Yeah.
Part of that is because there's been a shift in the Supreme Court between, for the first half of the 20th century, the Supreme Court and American courts in general were much more interested in the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, that, Congress shall make no law with respect to establishing a religion, right? In the second half of the 20th century, and especially with the conservative ascendancy, it becomes way more about the Free Exercise Clause,
right?
Or the free exercise thereof. And so legal theory becomes to be warped so that religious liberty, which meant freedom for churches, but also limitations on what they could receive from the state, because they were receiving other benefits, specifically tax exemptions, right? Like,
right.
When you give an organization a tax exemption, that's the American people essentially paying the bill for something that they wouldn't otherwise, right? That's what that is. Because that tax revenue has to be then shored up by the public. And essentially the Christian right wanted its cake and eat it. It wanted to have its cake and eat it too, where they wanted to have all of the freedom to do whatever they wanted, but they didn't want to have any of the responsibilities of receiving public funds and following the rules on that. Because there were, for example, Bob Jones University, which was a right evangelical university, was very explicit about banning Black people from attending until the federal government stepped in and said, if you're going to receive student loan money, or you're going to receive Pell Grants, you're going to receive any kind of public money, you have to desegregate your schools.
Yeah.
And so that's really the fight. I mean, they what they really want to do is they want to destroy public education. And that's a big part of the book too, where she talks about Betsy DeVos and the DeVos family and their involvement in school choice.
Yeah.
Because apparently they like choice when it comes to schools, but not really much with anything else.
Yeah.
And about how it's to undermine the public school system so that we can bring back private schools, particularly religious schools, that can then receive public dollars but not have to follow public rules. Yeah. And
that's your voucher systems and whatnot.
That's your voucher systems. That's the charter schools, all of it.
Yeah.
And I would say that a lot of liberals were useful idiots on this, in the sense that, a lot of them were sort of pro charter schools, despite the fact that if you look at charter schools, like their educational attainment's not really any better than your traditional public school.
Yeah.
And if anything, these whether it's the voucher programs or it's the school choice programs or the charters, they just take money away from the public schools that should just go to the public schools that would make them better. And it's the traditional right-wing playbook, which is the find a public program that you want to destroy, starve it of money and people.
Yeah. Ultimately privatize it.
Ultimately to privatize it.
Yeah.
And then to tell people, see, look how bad this is running. It's running so terribly. It's because you took its money.
Yeah.
And so you have all of that going on at the same time. She also has because we're getting towards kind of finishing up. Like there's a whole section of the book where she talks about how a lot of the spiritual leaders of the Christian nationalist movement were influenced by pro-slavery preachers, particularly a guy named R.J. Rushdoony and others who were very influenced by these antebellum and sometimes postbellum preachers and theologians who were very explicit in thinking that Black people are inferior, that slavery was actually a good thing for them, and that it civilized them, that kind of horrible shit. There's also the way in which this, of course, affects women, right? So when we're thinking, and people who can have kids. So when we're thinking about with the anti-abortion laws or violations of someone's human rights for your religious rights. So she has a good chapter in the book about how women's healthcare and healthcare in general often gets severely undermined by this expansion of religious liberty to include the ability to turn patients away because certain forms of care, whether it's abortions or medications that could induce abortions, are seen as immoral, so we don't do them. Because in America, a huge chunk of the hospitals are owned by Catholic organizations. So they have medical and they have moral directives that tell that so a woman can actively be having a miscarriage. The fetus can be dead inside her, and it could be going septic, and she could always dying before they actually do anything. And the author, Catherine Stewart, actually shares her own personal story of having this problem where she had a miscarriage. And they turned her away multiple times from the Catholic hospital that she went to before she could receive care. And and she had lost so much of her blood and was near death that when she went home, her toddler didn't recognize her. She didn't, her toddler didn't know who she was because she looked like she was so close to death. So this kind of stuff has a real world consequence. Whether it's taking away money from public schools, jeopardizing the lives of women and children. She talks about another preacher in this book called P.J. Smythe, who had decades of documented alleged sexual and physical abuse against children. So you have all of that going hand in hand, right? And so I think we live in a society that is very tolerant in a lot of ways. And I think that's a good thing. But sometimes we become so tolerant that we tolerate intolerance, that we tolerate these people who are seeking to undermine the liberal sort of broader democratic project, which they shouldn't,
they get to twist the language in a way that makes people who are tolerant believe that, oh, well, we have to let them have this extra privilege or else we're being the bad guys. And
exactly.
It's all just a dishonest framing of the way that things are supposed to work.
And in American politics, the right frame the debate and the left tends to respond to the right's framing. It's usually how it goes. And that's been a challenge. I mean, I think that with abortion, they have reaped what they've sown in the sense that you've had multiple states now approve laws or referendums that support a woman's right to choose. You are seeing, that the 2022 midterms were not nearly as good for Republicans as people thought they were going to be, specifically because of that. Trump won, but he in 2024, but his election was one of the closest in American history. Not to mention the fact that the House only had 5 seats. They have a 5-seat majority. That's it. Right. So the thing about the way that the American government is structured is that these policies, these sort of rabid right-wing Christian nationalist policies, are unpopular. And if they were to be run on directly, people wouldn't vote for it. They just wouldn't. That's why Trump ran away so hard from the Project 2025. The policy blue book by all these right-wing organizations, where he's like, I didn't have anything to do with that, despite the fact that a lot of people who were involved with it wrote it, and then he hired them as soon as he became president, and he's implementing it because he's a lying sack of shit. But it's also like, and so those are the kind of challenges we face. And so, at the end of the book, she says we need to have sort of a renewal of those broader, democratic values. We need to fight voter suppression laws. We need to fight Christian nationalism, whether it's on your local school board or it's in the White House. That you need to find ways to resist it. And so I would say the ways to resist it are to, build our alternative networks of power, whether it's mutual aid, whether it's organizing, whatever you're doing. Any little bit's going to fight back against this, because ultimately, this stuff is not very popular. Like if they actually had to say out exactly what they were going to do, no one would ever elect these people, or at the very least, they would be the minority. They would not be the majority. Most Americans don't believe in this crap. And I think that if they had run, I think if Trump and Republicans had run explicitly more on more of these Christian nationalist themes, I don't think they would have done as well.
Right. That's why they used the dishonest culture war bullshit.
Yes, exactly. Whether it's the anti-trans stuff or the anti-abortion stuff, they'll use it to sort of rile people up. In order to do their long-term goal, which is to destroy the federal government and to make sure that as it's currently constituted, they don't want it to go away completely. But to reconstitute the federal government in the service of Christian nationalism. So that's the book. That's The Power Worshippers.
Very cool.
Before we finish up, I do have a quick question for you that I forgot to ask that I wanted to mention to you in the pregame. So clearly, this discussion has been very U.S. based.
Right.
You're in Canada.
Yeah.
How does religious nationalism manifest itself in Canada?
Well, because we take our cues from the United States, it manifests in much the same way.
Okay.
But so like I live in Saskatchewan. We have almost the same stuff happening, although we're, a few decades behind with like the undermining of our education system, the privatizing of the payments going to private schools who are religious schools. There's been, there's fights all the time between various organizations trying to get like prayer out of city council meetings and other government meetings. And I think in BC, the BC Humanist Association just won in December a fight to remove a government-placed nativity scene.
Very good.
So there's these things in Canada that they mimic the United States basically.
That's good. That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, fortunately for you, it is behind. America is extremely progressive in its regressive natures, and it's in its regressive nature.
Right. Yeah, they're at the head of the curve on that.
We're at the head of the curve of being terrible. No, that's fascinating. I mean, I think that America is very unique in that regard. I mean, the United States was created, or America as a North America as a political entity was sort of created by religious fanatics, right? People who were so dogmatic that not even the Dutch would want them.
Right.
And so, there's the story we're told as a kids, like the Puritans, they wanted religious freedom. No, they didn't. They wanted the freedom. They wanted the freedom to establish their own theocracy and push people out.
Yeah.
Now that changes over time, and obviously it culminates in the founders. But yeah, I think that there's this real perversion of Jefferson that I find very frustrating, because, despite all of his serious flaws, and there are many, don't get me wrong, and that sort of, there's something in the DNA of being an American that's, for me at least, that's very Jeffersonian, which is to be critical of centralized institutions of power,
right? Which
is a key component of Jefferson. There's a more radical reading of Jefferson. I'm reading a book right now called the Radical Politics of Thomas Jefferson, and which is kind of the opposite of this other book I just read, and about how, one of the more charitable readings of Jefferson was that he was sort of this like communitarian anarchist, because yes, he was very critical of government. He was very critical of like centralized government power, but he was also very critical of centralized corporate power too. It wouldn't have been called that back then, but he was very critical of like the emergence of the overwhelming influence of like large financial and business interests in America, because it took away from his,
I remember when I was still first getting interested in anarchism, and I read some of the things that Thomas Jefferson said, and I thought this was the guy. This guy knew what he was talking about. This was it. And I mean, that was before I knew many of the problematic aspects of
course, or the fact that he didn't always practice what he preached, right?
Yeah,
he signed off on one of the single largest land acquisitions in American history without the consultation of Congress.
Yeah.
So it's like what makes Jefferson fascinating is there's this immense gulf between what his philosophy was and what he actually was. Right. It's that theory and practice. We've talked about this a lot with Lenin, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing with Jefferson. Jefferson's the same way. I like the phrase of imperfect vessels. Jefferson was an imperfect vessel for perfect ideas, in the sense of, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The governments are constituted among men, people, to not be gendered, and that they govern from the explicit consent of the governed, and that if they don't do that, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Right? Like these are very radical ideas. They're still radical today. They're ones that people need to But yeah, so like I find it very interesting when people want to try to make Jefferson out to be like this like right libertarian when he's clearly not. He's a left libertarian.
Yeah.
Jefferson belongs on the left. And you know,
for all his problems,
for all
he
of his
belongs on
problems,
the left.
for all of his problems, Jefferson belongs on the left. He's not a right winger.
Yeah.
And because he's critical of concentrations of power, period. It wasn't just the government.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, but again, it's these people just don't know the history, or they do, and they're just manipulating it for people who don't. And that's you almost have to wonder what's worse: people who don't know the history, and so they just kind of regurgitate whatever bullshit they hear, or the people who willingly mislead people.
Yeah.
And that's the Christian Nationalist Project. It's sort of willfully and purposefully misleading people in order for its broader political project, because that's what it is. Christian nationalism is not Christianity. There are many good Christians in America, the majority, I would say, who are not Christian nationalists.
Sure.
There are many great progressive churches, that have done great charity work, that have a lot of good people, and I think that's what people need to recognize, is that Christian nationalism is not Christianity. Their project is not a religious project. It is a political one.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting to think, like, because of some of the extremists that are Catholic in this regard, they often veer away from even the Catholic Church itself.
Totally.
And they don't even consider the current Pope as the true Pope because of, I think they even don't think that there has been a true Pope since whatever their favorite Pope was.
I know, right? So there are some people who they don't believe in the Second Vatican Council, which goes back to Pope John the 23rd in the 1960s. So when the Vatican II happened, it liberalized the church. This is where they go back. They get rid of the preachers standing with their back to the audience, to the pews, speaking all in Latin. They then turn to face their parishioners and speak in the language of their people. And there's a lot of other broader liberalizations that occur within the church, which again, you can make the argument that some of that's also happening under Pope Francis, although I think it's sort of uneven, as any institution like that would be.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people who don't see any Pope after John the 23rd and including him, as like legitimate.
Right.
They're like hardcore conservative Catholics. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's I think that's a really good point. And what's so funny, and people make this, I follow somebody on Instagram who is Catholic, who's a Marxist, like a progressive. So people who are like born Catholic tend to be far more liberal than people who convert. So people who tend to convert tend to be way, way more conservative than people who are born. This is your J.D. Vance, right? J.D. Vance didn't grow up Catholic. He converted to Catholicism. That's what makes him a psycho. Catholic converts are often wildly out of step with where most of Catholics are.
Yeah. I guess I'll just grab a comment before we start our close.
Sure.
Velkin999 said there was a Catholic priest who tried to appeal to Trump the other day with some reasonable talking points. Fox News called her calm speech a tirade.
Yes. I mean, there was the priest or the preacher at the Washington National Cathedral gave the sermon on the inauguration day, explicitly sort of arguing for Trump to provide mercy to people, whether it be undocumented immigrants or what have you. And the right lost their fucking minds, as if mercy was not a Christian value. Like they're like,
right,
what's this mercy shit? I mean, some of this is that, Christianity in America has always been a weird, perverted version of it, in the sense that it's always it exists to prop up established power and economic and political hierarchies. Engels writes about this, about how Christianity went from being a religion of the poor to the religion of the middle classes, specifically as a development of capitalism, that the sort of ideological institutions that exist in a society are then often used to prop up the economic institutions of society. This is very classic, base superstructure. This is very basic Marxism. And I think that's true. So sometimes Christian values, Christian values of like love thy neighbor and turn the other cheek and, blessed are the poor, they are the peacemakers. Like, it's easy for a camel to enter through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom.
Right.
Like, all that kind of shit, that goes out the fucking door. As if
Yeah.
Jesus is like some kind of like Ayn Rand acolyte who says, fuck you, I've got mine. It's a very weird, weird way of looking at the world. Doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So I guess we're done this one. What are we covering next? Oh, next time we're off.
Yes, next time we're off, I have a work event. We are celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Indiana State Library. So we're doing a big shindig on February 11th at work. So I will be out. So we're taking a little brief hiatus. So we will be back at the end of February to talk about The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism by Matt McManus, who's been a guest on your show.
Yes.
And this book has been requested by one of our viewers to do. And it's something that I've definitely wanted to do, is talk about the sort of liberal socialist tradition. And with this new book out, I thought there'd be a great opportunity to do that. So that's what we'll be doing with our next episode at the end of February.
Right on. And where can people find you?
You can find me at justinclark.org. The website's right down there. I recently, within the last couple of weeks, published an essay on Stephen King's Christine. I love movies. I love John Carpenter's film adaptation of Christine. So I wrote an essay about sort of comparing the two and why I think the movie is better in a lot of different ways.
Right.
But I read the book too, and the book's good. But the movie, I think, is a little bit better for a couple of different reasons. You can check that out at the blog. I'll be having a short book reviews compilation coming out in February on presidential history. I'm working on a variety of different projects, still working on the Gore Vidal project. I'm still working on the American Idiot project. Bunch of different stuff I'm going to try to work on this year. But I have these ideas in my head, kind of working on them. We'll see how they get going. It's sometimes I have more ideas in my head than I can actually do. But,
I know that feeling. For sure.
But you can also follow me on social media, Justin Clark PH. PH stands for Public History. You can follow me on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky. I'm also on TikTok, but not really active there. You want to follow the show more on TikTok? Follow Corey's TikTok account because that's where he posts the clips. But I'm mostly active on Instagram, and so you can give me a follow there. As always, please consider becoming a patron. Patreon.com/skeptical leftists. Becoming a patron, you'll get access to the pre-games, the post-games. You'll also get access to the patron-only live streams. We were going to do it in January. Wasn't a ton of enthusiasm.
Yeah,
for
it
that,
didn't seem like a lot of interest, so we did.
So we'll see what we'll do. And I know that Corey's also been doing some streams with Damian Marie at Hope.
Yes.
I would like to do another one where the three of us come together. We haven't done one in 3 years. I'd love to do that
for sure.
And maybe we'll do one of those soon. But yeah, definitely become a patron. Corey's been doing a lot of really interesting work, a lot of great stuff, fabulous editing on the episode on Eric Fromm and technology and the Revolution of Hope. Really good interviews, really interesting stuff coming down the pike. So, if you want to support the work, please become a patron.
It would be much appreciated. I guess thank you everybody for being in the chat and for watching and for listening. And thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Corey. And we'll see you guys in about a month.